All right. I believe this is the first inaugural Book Nerds book club, right? We've done a couple of these this year, and now we're formalizing it as Book Nerds because we like books. And Kyle let us know that we are all nerds. So those go together. We're really excited to announce that we will be doing this monthly next year. And next month we'll be doing it too. But in 2025, we're doing Book Nerds on a monthly basis. Would love for you to join and read along with us. And we decided earlier in a previous episode that listening to the book on audiobook counts as reading it. So if you want to listen along or read along and then join the discussion, we would absolutely love to have you join us and live submit your questions and your comments. We decided we're going to try to bring on some guests and have them recommend some of their favorite books and then help us discuss it. So I will put a link in the show notes to the webpage where you can see the calendar, what books we're reading. There's a link to where you can go and order the books. If you're lazy like me and don't want to go to the bookstore, you can just order it on Amazon and have it shipped straight to you. But with that, I'm excited to jump in today because this has probably been one of the is provocative a good word, guys? Like kind of provocative books that
yeah,
I think that's a good word.
And also I'm just like, I re-listened to it the last couple of days and I'm still trying to figure out what was the book about. And maybe I'm like dense and not I unbelievable storytelling, but then I'm still trying to drill down. I'm so used to listening or reading, nonfiction that's like specifically about how to grow your business, how to improve, or productivity or something like that. And this wasn't, this took more work for me to kind of draw out some conclusions and figure out. I think there's a lot here for us to talk about and a lot that it'll be interesting to see what you both think about, just a lot to draw from and apply to the eye care profession as well. So yeah, that's my first impression.
Yeah, my first impression was same, Kyle. So like, because I was the one like, hey, have you guys heard of this book? Should we read this one? You guys like blindly followed me, and then I was like into like chapter 3, and I was like, same thing. I was like, what is this about? But listening to this one because he's a great podcaster, is definitely the way to listen to this book or read this book. So I also had listened back to it also to kind of relearn a little bit about what it was about. So I'm again, when we got on here, where is this conversation going to take us? So let's see.
So it's interesting you said, Kyle, that one lesson learned on blindly following Bree, but but where it's funny because you, like you said you like the books that have a clear purpose and a business driving.
Oh man, make it clear for me. Yeah,
clear. And I love things that are provocative and make me think. And my overall synopsis of this is it challenged traditional thinking and status quo. Like it took your whole life and your way of thinking and flipped it entirely upside down in a good way and made me go back and look at The Office and say, okay, well, what do I believe that probably isn't the right beliefs? Right? Where are the scapegoats that I'm blaming that probably aren't the right scapegoats? How does thinking move and shift behavior? The rule of thirds was huge. And really, I kind of took it and said, wow, I've now got a whole lot of different levers I can start playing with to make things happen. And maybe the workload isn't as big as I thought it was. I just need to move the right levers in the right time.
Yeah. Did either of you read? So I don't know if did we say what book we've read? It's Malcolm Gladwell. To the listener, 5-10 minutes in here, what book we read was Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point. So it's kind of like, I think his original, The Tipping Point, it was a blockbuster hit, or in terms of a book, bestseller, I think maybe 18 years ago. And so this is The Revenge of the Tipping Point. And I honestly didn't read The Tipping Point, and I've heard a lot about it. And I went back and, watched like a video or YouTube just to try to get some ideas of what he did talk about there. But just to give you the listener, if you haven't read the book, like I found a pretty good place. It's in chapter 1, I believe, where he talks about, Revenge of the Tipping Point is an attempt to do a forensic investigation of social epidemics. So that's the Revenge of the Tipping Point, the very same tools we use to build a better world. So like when he talks about the tools of reaching a tipping point to cause like big, massive changes in the culture, socially, lots of different realms. Essentially, Revenge of the Tipping Point is the very same tools that we can use can actually be used against us as well. And that's really probably the main theme of the book. And he's a master storyteller. And like you said, Brianna, if you haven't read this yet or listened to it yet, listen to it, because it's like the best 8-hour podcast you'll listen to. It's just fantastic. So
and also in the title, it talks about overstories, super spreaders, and the rise of social engineering. So kind of what I took away from this was just our, like you said, Aaron, how we're taught in school, how our own belief systems come about. And he takes us through like bank robbers to Miami and all of the Medicare fraud, which I was like, I live in Miami, and I was like, oh my God, that's insane. Like, no wonder all these people are down here. And then he takes you through the Poplar Grove, which is just a high school on what went south in social engineering. The Magic Third, which we'll get into because that was your favorite part too, Aaron. Then how Harvard puts placements on academia, but way on sports as well. So if you're over indexed in one area, how that all goes south. So kind of like in optometry school, right? Like where did all the dudes go? Like my class was the first class that was 70-30 of men to female ratios, right? So what does that look like for our profession? Not that it's bad, like we're not saying any of this is bad, but it's things to keep an eye on. Then you had how COVID started. Back to one patient was like patient 0. Then the Holocaust, which was the story there.
Shocking.
How they just put their heads down and like they didn't have grandparents. They didn't have, and they just literally recreated a society and how they did it. So then Maple Drive. And then he ends like the chapter 9, like maybe you start at chapter 9.
Yeah.
Or like a synopsis of everything. So yeah, I'm excited to jump in here and like maybe just pick a chapter and kind of or one of the stories and talk about it.
Well, I think he opened the book with the interview or of the tape or recording of the interview of the let's see here, Purdue Pharma, basically in court over what they did with OxyContin. And that's kind of the thread. It's almost like he went to trying to understand why we came across like I think potentially the whole point of the book is to try for him to understand, and then for us to understand like what happened with why did we have this opioid epidemic? Like what caused that? And I think as he dug into that, he found all these themes that he probably had other stories that kind of highlighted those themes in a different way. And so that's kind of why you just talked about all these random stories, but he puts them all together with specific, the importance of an overstory. Like if you were to talk about how would you define an overstory? An overstory is kind of like essentially the main belief system of like small regions or maybe even, maybe not even small regions, but areas of the country, like geographic regions have specific ideas about or beliefs about what they do. And then
here I have a definition here, Kyle, for an overstory.
Yeah, go for it.
So he said the overstory is, think of it as the upper layer of the foliage in a forest, and the size and the density and the height affect the development of everything below it. So that's one thing when I went back and listened, I was like, oh, because I didn't really understand what the definition was. So for all of
Yeah.
us book nerds here, when we define something, now we can actually get into it. But yeah, keep going.
No, that's good. I mean, I probably would say my favorite chapters were the one on the Medicare fraud. I thought that was fascinating because I've kind of followed that quite a bit in the last like 5 to 10 years and just understanding that. And then also the final, the last chapter when he pieced it all together to talk about the opioid epidemic. But that's it. Let's jump into the Medicare fraud. That's like, what about that? Like, what are some of the statistics there that were just so unbelievable? Let's see here. Trying to find some.
I think the biggest surprise for me is that just the blatant fraud, right? And maybe it's the how I grew up, my overstory, right? And just the people are good people, and people live within a system and play by the rules for the most part within a system. And maybe we all drive 75 on the freeway, but there's not a whole lot of people just blatantly driving 100. And to the
Except
point
you're
where
except in Miami. Aaron.
clearly in Miami, yeah, right. And but it was like the not only breaking the rules, but like giving them the middle finger while you're doing it, right? Like there wasn't any shame in abusing the system, and how rampant it was, but also that it was so contained to a certain area, because you would have thought that it was across the board. And I saw.
So the big stat was 67 million people are on Medicare. Medicare is $900 billion a year they spend. 900 billion. Did I say million? $900 billion a year. $100 billion of fraud a year goes to just a subset of people was the number. And what they did was they not only recruited the doctors, because the doctors had to sign the charts, they recruited patients as well.
They built
and
a whole
then
ecosystem.
They would walk into the banks. The banks actually were behind it too, to launder the money. So they would stage these pharmacies, stage these like shields of practice. So it's like hanging a shingle. Maybe that's where this comes from. Like hang your shingle and you'll make a lot of money.
Yep.
But it was discerning and disheartening because here we are working super, super hard. We're in this rat race also. So that's where it really like, it took me way back. I was like, no wonder this is so hard. Because we're doing it right.
Yeah. And I think he said let's see here, in the state of Florida, like if you look at the major cities across the state of Florida, they each spend about let's see here, about $200, or they receive about $200 per patient in every other city in Florida. But with Miami itself, it's $1,200.
Yeah.
$1,200 per patient is what Miami has versus $200 per patient everywhere else. So clearly there's a problem there. And his, Gladwell's whole point is like, well, why is that happening? And it's what it came, the conclusion of it's an overstory. It's that has been formed in Miami. And there are what he talked about in the previous book, the tipping point of law of the few. And this is where a law of the very, very few. And that's essentially the understanding that there are very few people that tend to be responsible for these massive events or like these epidemics that occur, right? And we hear about these huge numbers, but like you said, with Medicare fraud, but at the end of the day, it's really like very few people that are responsible for it. And so one of the questions he asked, and we can talk about the COVID thing as well, the COVID chapter, but one of the questions he asked is like, so what do you do? Do you create some sort of, is it a law or rules based upon the very few, to find the very few and affect everybody else that's doing the right thing? And how do you go about that in the future to prevent these things when it's only a very few? So, It's one of the questions that was kind of left unanswered in the book.
Well, I love the idea of the very few, because in I think what we look at across the board is we like, at least my brain likes to have a cause and effect, right? Going to COVID, right? If you were sick, you could infect everybody. If you were sick, you could infect everybody, whatever illness you have.
I'm hydrating right now.
Yeah, and
Same here.
if you read the book, you'll know exactly what she's meaning. But when they did this, but when they looked at the studies, it was only 1 or 2 people out of the entire study population group, when they looked about who was aerosoling and who was really contaminating, that were the cause of it, and which goes against traditional thinking, and it goes against what we're doing. The opioid epidemic, they trace back to a handful of doctors in a handful of states that drove this. The Medicare fraud is happening with a handful of people in a very small area, which goes against, I think, traditional thinking. And that's why I like how it challenged status quo, because we think that the rule applies to everybody. Mm-hmm. And we apply the rules to everybody when really it's the exact opposite on all the examples he showed.
Kyle, it'd be fun to do like your billing course, right? Because I think that as optometrists, we're taught to underbill, which is almost just as dangerous as
it's an overstory.
Overbilling. There's our overstory here. That's how we bring it back here. So are you charging a 99213 when it was really a 99214? Are you waiving the Optos that you should have charged? Are you billing well, I know Aaron doesn't do this because he charges everything the same for a contact lens patient, but are you
down coding to try to I'm the jerk in the room
here. We do it all the time. So I think that's also just as dangerous. So like, where does that sit with optometry? Where does that sit with physicians, right? Because when you pay attention to, again, the few versus the masses, that's, I think, too, where we can make some positive evolution here to just think about what you're doing. Like,
and what is the overstory that's causing that, right? What is it that we're believing? Like, is there an overstory? I'm convinced that there is, but is there a singular mindset or a singular belief that is causing a lot of the issues that we're facing in terms of, essentially it's devaluing our care, right? It's not really believing in the value that we provide for the patient. And so it trickles down to down coding and writing off things when we shouldn't, and not charging, and lowering our fees, and all those things. I think it definitely does that. So I think there is an overstory. So I don't know where that came from, right?
I think it's a historical overstory, but one of the biggest ones that we come across, at least I fight against, is it okay to make money? Right? Is it okay as an optometrist to be profitable? And the simple answer is yes. And then we go, but we downcode. We give away things for free. Chris Wolf talks a lot about what's your identity, and being able to say, I'm good at what I do and I should charge for it. One of my favorite examples I ever saw of him was he asked the whole room, hey, who's the best person here? Whole room of optometrists. Who's the best contact lens fitter in this room? And not a single person stood up or raised their hand, and they all kind of sheepishly shrugged down and looked left and looked right. And then he said, if I would go to a room full of refractive surgeons and said, who's the best LASIK surgeon in the room, not only would they all stand up, there'd be fistfights over who was the best one in the room. And it's not a negative against us. It's just that is that part of our overstory that we don't want to typically stand out. We don't want to be the light on top of the hill. We want to be kind of part of that group. We're pack people. And again, I'm not knocking us. It's who we are. Yeah. We would rather not have an audit because I don't want to prove that I'm right. I just want to not deal with it at all. I don't want to challenge a patient. I'd much rather have the third party payer pay me and not the patient have to pay me. And I think that trickles down into our staffs and how we run our businesses, whether you're in retail or working in a hospital or ambulatory setting or private practice.
Yeah, part of it too is we live in such a cool environment where we get to also sell what we prescribe.
Mhm.
So one thing I know that we're not taught sales. Many of us have, like I have a kind of a sales background because my dad was a furniture builder and sold furniture, so I have that ingrained in me. What I've turned it to say is it's providing a solution to a patient. So if I don't provide them the solution and a way for them to get it from me, I'm doing them a disservice. So it's not that I'm selling them this dry eye treatment or myopia control, or I want them to buy their contacts from me, right? I'm making it convenient, carefree. The cost is right. We know we're not overcharging. We know we're doing all this right by the patient. So if you hate the word sales, that's okay. But you do need to provide a solution. Nobody likes to go get their eyes checked. Like, we're crazy if we think that they do. They made an appointment with us for a reason, and they want to get their care all the way through. So you have to be okay charging, and this comes from school, right? Because I'm married to an MD. They just walk out and then the billing's taking care of them. So we actually then have to circle our billing and then have the fight with the patient for the billing. That's where it comes in with vision plans and medical plans. So understanding what part of that fight, because we all go through it. Your staff fights with the patient over this copay. Your staff fights with your patient over this copay. You fight with the patient over the copay. So then you end up just like with your tail between your legs, like, oh my God, fine, it's only $10. But then we give gift cards out all day. Like, here's 10 for you, here's 10 for you, here's 10 for you. Like, just switching your mindset. Like, if you do that, right, write 10 contact lens prescriptions a day and 5 of them walk out. That sucks. Like, that super sucks.
Yeah.
So it's investing in these little things along the way. But I think that's the overstory right there.
Do you think that comes from, is there an overstory that is perpetuated by the schools in training, or do you think it precedes that?
I think it starts in school because they're like, just do this for free, just to learn it, to learn how to do it. Just run that test because you should learn it.
I think it starts in the schools, and I think it starts there, but it carries over into the rest of the industry post-graduation.
Yeah.
So the schools are set up not to make money from their clinics. They're set up to make money from students enrollment by far and away. And I appreciate that they're taking care of a population that needs to, right? I mean, most clinics are not high-end clinics at the schools, right? We're managing a patient population that needs that care. And if they were meant to make money, we'd have been taught to bill properly and code them properly for our services. So,
oh my God, I never looked at it like that.
It's about teaching an institution. It's about teaching the students to pass the boards and become a doctor, to start their journey, not the end of the journey, the start. And my dad told me the day I graduated, congrats, you'll be a doctor in 5 years. And I thought he was a jerk until 5 years later. And I go, wow, dude knew what he was talking about. I'm embarrassed to look at my charts for the first 5 years out of school. But then when we get into organized optometry, we have groups that are pushing back against third-party payers and working with third-party payers, but I don't see a lot of groups other than, I'll be biased, groups like Vision Source that are saying, hey, here's how you make money. It's this third-party payer needs to pay me more, not I need to learn how to sell better. I need to learn how to run a better business. It's not the patient needs to pay me more. It's, whatever third-party payer, insurance, managed vision care, whatever it is, it's their responsibility to make sure that I'm successful. And so I think that part of that overstory, and I'm going to get hate mail for this, is that at what point are we controlling it, or at what point are we being the victims? Right? I'm subject to what managed vision care is doing to me. I'm subject to what big box is doing to me. Everybody's doing something to me. And when do we flip that as an entire industry to say, no, we're the ones in control and we're driving the ship? And I think there's pockets that are doing that really
Maybe
well.
We're at a tipping point where that's happening.
Are we at 30% yet?
Hey, let's be the very, very few.
Yes.
And keep pushing forward, right? I mean, that's one thing that you can draw out of the book is it does just take, a couple people that can really change things. And there's more than us that are doing that and think this way.
Yeah.
I would almost, I think that I would agree, but also disagree with, does it proceed or not? I do think, I kind of look at it like a large, randomized controlled trial where you intervene, like in my mind, the intervention is optometry school. And to me, the intervention of optometry school I don't think it quite yields as much of the overstory as we think it does. I think that there's, like, to continue the comparison, I think that there's a sort of like selection bias, meaning I think the type of person, not all, but I think the type of student that chooses optometry school rather than like MD route or DO or dental or something like that, I think there is a difference in the mindset there, which I think leads to like magnifies or increases the overstory there. So I think there is that as well. So I would agree that I think it's perpetuated, or somehow it just isn't taught as well, the value of our care in optometry school. But I think it does precede that a little bit too, just based upon the type that's choosing our field versus some other, medical
Well,
school.
that talks to the Waldorf example, right? Because once you the right kind of person's going to select to go to a type of person's going to select to send their kids to a Waldorf school.
Yeah.
But once you're in, you get reinforced by the overstory within that. They were talking about the percentage of children in Waldorf schools who'd received their typical vaccines and vaccinations, and how they were much lower. So I think if you're going to choose to pay to put your kid in that type of school, you've already kind of self-selected a little bit, but then once you're in, it reinforces that story, and you become more ingrained.
Well, there was a part too, I think, where he said, allow yourself to find your tribe, which I think is what social media has really allowed us to do. It's really allowed us to branch out, see what others are doing, because even in our own networks locally, it's hard to find that. And I think optometry in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, they really had that. They had a culture that was together. They shared a lot, and they were really resilient for it. That was kind of lost in like my years of school, right? You still kind of had it, but that's when the rise of social media happened. So again, he said, allow yourself to find your tribe. What you give up in uniformity is resilience. And then it's kind of like you're on this long, straight highway with no off ramp. So what's the off ramp, right? So this is where you acknowledge that you don't have to keep doing the same thing. And you have to be part of the evolution, not change, because change, gives us a hit of cortisol. Nobody likes change. So again, it's evolution that we're allowed to evolve, and then that's your dopamine hit.
I like that. And then to get there, I really want to talk about the 30% rule, the rule of thirds, the magic third that he talked about, because to make that change, it's they talk about, there was a quote that I highlighted, I love, that says, when you're part of a small community, you're a token, and being a token's not easy, right? And I'm looking and wondering where these are at, because I think initially, surgical procedures within optometry, we all knew who the docs were that were doing it, and there were tokens, and we respected it, but you were the surgery guy or gal, right? You were the surgery person. It wasn't ubiquitous across the board. And I think a lot of the new technologies that come out and adaptations that come out, whether it's I'm dropping managed vision care plans, or I'm going to not have an optical and just do service, whatever the case is, right? IPL, when it first started, we all know that one person, and good, bad, or otherwise, we were kind of a token. They were a token until we grew to enough to where it became just, this is normal. It's just what happens.
Yeah. So the tipping point, he says, is a threshold The moment something that seems immovable seems to change overnight. So that token piece was, it was part of the sales team. So there was like 10 sales women in an organization, but they weren't together. And how they were all looked at tokens and had to fight for that. And then you had the law of the few. So he was talking about, I'm from Colorado, so this one hit home, like Denver's air quality. So where you don't want to, nobody likes to work on asymmetry. So instead of the few or the few cars on the road that were responsible for 90% of the bad air quality in Denver, they put on this emissions test where all the cars have to be tested. So moving from a position that a problem belongs to all to the problem that is caused by a few is difficult. And that means we would rather breathe dirty air. Mm-hmm. So it's not pointing people out, or how do you essentially point people out in a good way for their differences?
Or call the bad ones out in a bad way without having to punish everybody. Right. In this case, like go after the bad cars, not make a burden for everybody that pushes back. I was thinking while you were talking in the definition of tipping point, and I'm curious, what crossed my mind is that myopia management in optometry in the last few years has hit its tipping point, right? Because it was certainly being done previously, and I could tell you exactly who I knew who was doing it, and if somebody was interested, I would, because I didn't at the time, I would send them to them. Well, now it seems like everybody's doing it. It's I don't want to call it a fad because that's the wrong word for it, but it seemingly overnight, right, became the topic of conversations and conferences and meetings, and it came out of nowhere.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up, by the way, too. So we're on the heels of a big congressional paper getting published in October. So it's 374 pages. If anybody wants to put themselves to sleep, you can read it. But myopia in the middle of October was reclassified as a disease by the government. Cool. So if we're talking, right, this is like the tipping point of myopia. It's a cool place to stand. And Aaron, you and I have had this conversation. Not all myopia is bad, right? So we have to figure out who are going to be the progressors and who we have to treat, which I think we're getting much, much better at. Not everybody's going to end up a -4, -6, -10. So it's a cool place that we're in right now. I think the same thing in dry eye aesthetics, IPL, RF, all of those are right there at the tipping point. And it started again with those few people. Keep on believing, keep knowing that they're doing right by the patient.
Yep.
And that's where all this wins, is when you're doing right by the patient. Not for the managed care plans, not for the reps that come and visit you, not for the money that you're making. No. That's the circle, that's the core. And I think that's what's really special about optometrists is how much we freaking care. We care so much that we hurt ourselves.
Well, there's the what was the name of the community that same thing? They cared so much about the success of their kids that they hurt themselves.
Poplar Grove.
Poplar Grove. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. I wonder with the example with myopia control, if, I would agree we've reached a tipping point for sure. We have, it's not just a few people doing that anymore. But I also wonder if we can, you've already said it, Brianna, but I wonder if more people, it will become way more accepted, because I think there's still a lot of people that push back on it. If it'll be way more accepted if we can get to the bottom of the asymmetry of it, right? Same thing as like, hey, there's only a few cars that are causing 90% of the pollution in Denver. And then we find out that it's only a handful of people that actually aerosolize viruses at an exponentially high rate. And one person is likely responsible for 300,000 infections because he is a super spreader. Like he specifically emits more aerosols while he's speaking. So you wonder if as we know, and I think that's the direction of the research too, is as we know more and more about who is way more likely to be the 5, 6, 7s, 8s or whatever, versus the patients that are going to stay at the 1s and 2s. I think that's when you really reach like mass acceptance. And I think we'll get there for sure. It doesn't like me not, we do a lot of myopia management at our practice. So just because I don't know that yet, that uncertainty doesn't hold me back like it does a lot of other people, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, on the aerosolization, have you guys found yourself like talking to people and wondering how much aerosol is coming back at you? I've completely lost the conversation because all I can do is picture how much aerosol is coming back, and then me trying to figure out how to talk to you, but not talk your direction, kind of talk this way. And
oh my God. So what we're talking about, I remember reading this chapter, I was like, I am wearing a mask for the rest of my life. Remember my text I sent to you guys? Because you knew right where I was in the book. So what happens is our vocal cords is obviously they touch and then they pull, and this is going to sound gross, but there's like spit strings that grow. And the more dehydrated, and when that spit string pops is when you get the aerosol. So if your spit strings, if you're dehydrated, which is why we keep drinking when we like talk about this, if you're dehydrated, then the aerosols are smaller, and so they spread faster and further. So versus a sneeze doesn't go very far because the spit bubbles aren't that big. So when we're talking about spit bubbles, that's what we're talking about. Oh my God. So they talked about patient 0 flying from, maybe he was on a plane from Europe, flew to this conference in Cali, and got up on stage, was super dehydrated, was actually speaking from stage. So he was like spreading so much of his little aerosol spit bubbles, which infected the whole conference. And then went back and fell ill. So they had written, when they found out who it was, they'd written a paper to be published, and they said it was going to be 30,000, was it 20,000, 30,000 people affected, when it was actually 300,000, and nobody could figure it out. So when you're traveling and you're at conferences, make sure you're hydrated.
Yes.
Well, I always think too, now that I kind of have a rule, no talking at the slit lamp, like just because I used to just always explain everything that I'm doing. And, right there when I'm at the slit lamp, looking at the lids, like, I don't feel comfortable talking.
You don't have your spit protector?
Then they're going to, well, I do. Yes. But you still think like, it's still just, flinging everything out there, but maybe there's probably, there's likely no difference between that distance and, as we're just speaking face to face after the exam, it's only 3 or 4 more feet, but still. But yeah, that thought has been on my mind too. That was quite the chapter on COVID and Mr. Index. It was a Biogen conference, wasn't it? Somebody that came in, that was like mid-February of 2020. They had a big conference and they decided to just move on with it. And then there was ended up being a super spreader event.
Yeah. So I go the other way on the law of the few, that I drink so much that I'm not one of the few. And we made sure that there was prominent water stations as soon as you walk in the office. Are you thirsty? Get a glass. Right. Yeah. Let's hydrate people.
That's right.
But it's interesting knowing that, but thinking how we thought that, you had a cough and now you were instantly going to contaminate everybody. Right? We painted and treated everybody with the same brush, and we don't want to segment people out. We don't want to identify people and treat them differently, when that was the main thought I kept reading through the book, is that you've got to treat people as different and individuals, and the same rules don't apply to everybody across the board.
What else was thought-provoking about it was they knew this very, very early on during the pandemic. I think had they shared that, like what we're sharing right now, all of us would have happily put on a mask and kept the mask on and probably not fought back so much. I know I probably would have viewed it completely different. So it's just about the misinformation that's out there. Again, keeping the knowledge with the few does nobody any good.
Mm-mm.
This brings me to another point in the book. It said, if change happened gradually, you could see you were getting closer and closer to your goal, so you would keep going. And you wouldn't be surprised when you reached it. But if nothing happens and then everything happens, you're in this strange position of being discouraged along the long stretch when nothing is happening, and then stunned when everything happens. So we can always connect the dots
That's
going
neat.
back. You can't really connect it going forward. It also, like, he talked a lot about TV and how, again, he like was all over the place in this book,
Yeah.
talking gay marriage and epidemics to suicide to the Holocaust. Like, it was just, again, this is how we can kind of all bring this back together. Pay
So my
attention
question,
to what you're consuming.
yeah,
You can't really take it at face value anymore. You have
yeah.
to ask.
What's the overstory? Yeah, and another question we could ask each other too is how many. This is kind of shifting topics a little bit, but how many times did so and so rep visit your office last month? Was it one time, or was it 3 times, Aaron? Or
Mhm.
was it 4 times?
Is there a reason they like me so much? Yeah.
The last chapter, he wraps it all up to talk, all the different stories he pulls together and creates some common threads about, overstories, super spreaders, and what's the third one? Law of the few. No.
Yep.
Law of the few.
Law of the few. Yep.
And he just really unpacks what happened over the last probably 75 to 100 years to cause what he would theorize to cause the opioid epidemic. And, from the beginning of the 1930s and 40s, when there was a guy by the last name of Madden who was created this, protocol, the triplicate, and he created it in the state of California so that anytime any doctor had to prescribe opioid to a patient, they had a 3-papered, prescription. The top went to the patient, the middle one went to the government, and then the last one they had to keep on file there. And basically, that practice alone, a bunch of states, didn't want to do it. Some states did want to do it, but that practice alone created this overstory for a long time that the opioids were dangerous, and they were addictive, and they could be a problem for people. And so, basically, up to 5 years ago, I think when this case was closed, I forget when it was, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. But up to 3 or 4 years ago, that practice alone essentially determined which states had the most opioid-related deaths, and which had the least. Was based can be traced back to which states adopted the triplicate and which did not, which is just incredible to think about.
Yep. And then the states that didn't have the triplicate, they identified a handful of providers that became the I don't want to say the mouthpieces, but very vocal. And I didn't read into there that they believed they were doing anything wrong. I think that they believed they were truly helping people and doing things right. And but their story got told and heard and supported because the company obviously is going to find opportunities for them to tell their story in most places as possible, and so that it perpetuated and it spread. So it could be traced back to a handful of states and a handful of providers within those states, which made me wonder, when we're listening to all the different speakers from all the different stages, we've got open platform or open payments rather. How many times do I go and look up what somebody's open payments are? And I know when I speak, I put a QR code straight up there that takes people directly to it, and a picture of it, because I just, we all have our biases, but I want to get that out in the open, as opposed to just, hey, here's a list of companies that I've done some stuff for, right? Here's exactly what I've done and why they've done it. If you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. but I think that there's some, not that, and I'm not knocking any of the speakers. I think it's very important we have experts share their best practices with us, but I think we also need to be aware of biases just so we can factor it in as appropriate and to make decisions on how I want to take that information and apply it to what we do.
Yeah, one thing
Yeah,
was
and the opioid epidemic, clearly the things that they taught those pharmaceutical reps to do, basically they decided that, hey, if you find a doctor that's really receptive to your affirmation, then you need to visit them like 2 or 3 times a month. And that was the ticket. If you visited them 2 or 3 times a month, they were the ones that were going to prescribe that medication exponentially more than anybody else. And so those practices, like, we can't just think that that's just something that we don't really prescribe. That that's also part of, big pharma and everybody else, right? So we just have to be really aware of the tactics, and when they want our attention and when they want meetings, like, there's obviously we know them personally, and I know my reps well. But at the end of the day, like, my duty, my responsibility is to my patients, and not to be promoting or pushing, a drug because of kickbacks or reciprocity or anything like that, or gifts or lunches or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to pose a question to you guys. I think we have to realize that as doctors, right, we're the shark in Shark Tank. So we get to say yes or no. And you need to take that on as a really critical point in your profession. So you can't stay in your dark room. You do need to make time for these reps. When you're at these exhibit halls, you need to go around and understand that you're the shark. Our industry, we have to figure a way. And again, like, I cold call offices. Like, I'm not going to hide what I do, right? With Dr. Contact Lens, like, how do we get information out? Because we're not leaning into these conversations. We're not asking the right questions. And then we're being led blindly by these reps to make really bad decisions for the patients, really bad decisions for our practices. And I think we're at, again, when we're talking about a tipping point, I think we're at another tipping point here with big data. And we're tripping over, I'll go on my soapbox here, but if you're getting something for free, you are the freaking product. Like, understand, the reps are there to lead you and guide you, and they have a job to do. So on the McKesson, like, they had McKesson come in and say, don't pay attention to these 99 other doctors, pay attention to this one. And that's where the opioid epidemic actually came from, was the 1% of people. But how do we want to get information out there? Aaron, you see it. Kyle, you see it. Like, how do people want to learn about things? Is it magazines? Is it trade shows? Like, guys, these booths are dead, but you want to have these amazing conferences, right? We want to have these experiences, but none of us are leaning in. Very few of us are leaning in. That's not how industry meets us. That's not how we meet industry. But then we're upset when you can get an online refraction, when you can get your prescription fulfilled wherever. Like, thoughts? I'll get off my soapbox about, but that's, again, we're at this tipping point. It all comes down to understanding the special position that you sit in.
I think a lot of it is just, you talked about big data, but I'll talk small data too, knowing your data, knowing where you are in your office. And so going to the Shark Tank analogy, which is perfect, right? Those guys know their numbers. And so when they get presented with an offer, they know how to analyze it back. They know how to, what questions to ask. And they're really not hard questions. They just know the numbers. And I was talking with a handful of consultants, and they were lamenting that they've been teaching and doing the same thing for the last 10 years. And I said, well, don't complain, because if nobody's going to change, you can still keep making money, right? And like, but it's so basic, I want to go higher. And I said, that's because we haven't taught people yet how to look in. And I know, Kyle, you analyze practices. Brianna, you analyze contact lens stuff. I analyze practices, and I get accused of being smart because I know what questions to ask. And it's not tough, but when you can peel the curtain back just a little bit and show somebody what they don't know, I get the credit for being smart. You get the credit for being smart. When my frustration is, you guys, like, you should be doing this. You should be peeling back your own layer and onion, and instead of saying, hey, tell me what's wrong, I come to you and say, hey, I've analyzed it. Here's where I think I'm stuck. Just get a different perspective on it for me, and then we can have a better, more intelligent conversation. But we don't know what we don't know. And Chris and Kyle have done a ton of good work on the medical KPI side through Comprehensive Optometry Simplified. You ask anybody, hey, are you treating glaucoma patients how you should? Absolutely. Right? That is not something we mess up until we look at the data. And not by malintent, but it's something we don't do right. Where's your gonial lens? Oh, I remember that from school, but I haven't touched it in 10 years. But I'm treating glaucoma. Where's your visual field numbers when you're supposed to be running it a couple times a year on a patient, but you've got 100 glaucoma patients and you ran your visual field 50 times. Like, where's it off? But you don't know that until you look at the data. And so I think that being able to be the shark means, one, looking at your data, being able to say, hey, I've got some problems. Let's fix those internally, right? Just opportunities, not problems. I'm not bad. I just have some weaknesses. And then now when reps come in and say, hey, I have this amazing product that can help you, we can truly analyze it and go, that might be great, but it ain't for me. Or you're right, it is good. Here's exactly where I want to fit it into my ecosystem to help my patients and help my practice.
Yeah, it's that paralysis by analysis I think we get stuck into. So it's staying curious. I think that's where books have opened my eyes. Like, again, in the industry side, we're told we're bad at business. We're not bad at business. We're actually a sure thing, guys. Like 99% of the banks are going to loan us a lot of money. Like, we are a sure thing, let me tell you. Look at private equity, what they're doing, what they're coming in. I think it's staying curious and always being a life learner. Do you guys know what the Hippo effect is? This isn't in this book, but I just learned what the Hippo effect is. It's the highest paid person's opinion. So we're all hippos in our practices. I learned this at the Inc. 5000 conference by a girl that was chief of staff. Her name is Ann Hyatt. Follow her on LinkedIn. She's freaking incredible. Hiatt. And she was chief of staff for Jeff Bezos. She was also chief of staff for Google's CEO. So from 2002 to 2012, she was chief of staff for Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Can you imagine what she's heard? And then chief of staff for the CEO of Google. She talked about Jeff Bezos being really understanding of his Hippo effect. He even had a position called the shadow. So again, we're the smartest people in our practices, which is a really dangerous place to be and a really dangerous place to live. And this is where you need to ask for holes. So if you're doing a staff meeting, always make sure if you pose a question, you're the last one to speak, because your Hippo effect, as soon as you say something, it's completely squashed everybody else below you.
That makes perfect sense.
Again,
that sounds like how we
come back together.
That sounds like how we interview new people. Hey, I love patients and I love giving good care and I love doing this and that. What do you like? I love patients and I love giving.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, you're amazing. And then I hire you and you're none of those things.
That's great.
Oh my God.
Yeah, here's my core values.
What away from that conversation for interviews from now on. Man, is that why I'm not in trouble?
Yeah, that's good. I also think about, like, going back to Brianna, you were talking about the like trade shows and just, with our big events, our big meetings. I completely agree with you. And as with the recent, not to get all into politics, but even the recent election with the new potential appointment to the, Department of Health, he is a hawk on conflict of interest. You just wonder, what does it look like to be able to function at a conference without without industry? Or what does it look like to function even in our profession without a lot of industry help, right? And I think it's a good question that you asked, is like, how do you really want to learn? Because I think people don't, like, they kind of take it for granted that they have, access to all this stuff, but we don't take it, on our own. We don't do enough of digging on our own to really figure things out. We kind of take a passive approach to our own learning and education. Because at some point, like, that I don't think that, industry support and all that, I don't think that's really going to change too much. But I always think, like, how could we do this in a way that is seemingly more pure, I guess is a way of saying it, in terms of conflicts of interest. And I don't think it's really possible, but all that in my mind just kind of goes together in what we're talking about, of asking those questions of how would it happen in our industry, and then would we be able to accept that as optometrists?
I don't know. We've all been to the same events. Rule of three. Let's go into
rule of
it.
three. Like, I think we need to.
Here.
Right. I think that's where we need to set some rules of the game. And there was a part in the book where they talked about the name, right? Where I can't remember the exact study, but you had to come up with the same name. Right. And they and when he purposely put people into the game that knew the rules and had a job, right, to try to drive the game to everybody get to the same name. Once you hit that third, it was really quick how fast there was alignment within the group. And so sharing in a positive way, because I think we go down the negative pathway too often in optometry, especially on Facebook groups. But instead of being anti and saying what can't happen and what shouldn't happen and yada yada, hey, when we go in, this is the attitude we're going to be taking, right? Let's collectively agree that these are the positive changes we want to make, and this is how we're going to do so with the right attitude. As speakers, like, it's impossible to not have a conflict of interest. So let's just call it out where they're at, right? Let's just be upfront, because now there's trust. When we're gonna go visit and talk to the different vendors, doesn't mean we're signing up with them, and but we're gonna do more than steal the candy out of the bowl they have in front, or the really cool pen that they spend a lot of money on bringing.
You call those trick-or-treaters, Aaron, on the industry side?
I bring my bag. I got my bag.
That's
how many rubber balls do we all need?
That's hilarious.
Well, they stay in the hotel room. Right, but like let's just say we're gonna have a conversation. Right? I'm gonna listen to you, and if I'm not going to engage with the product, I'm not gonna tell you I'll call you when I'm not gonna call you, right? And maybe I say, hey, I like what you're doing here. Here's why it works for me, or here's why it doesn't work for me. Right? Let's give some honest feedback to each other, because I believe that 99% of everybody wants to do the right thing, and the products they're coming out with want to help. It doesn't mean it's going to work for me, but that doesn't mean it's a bad product. If it doesn't work for me, it might work for Kyle, might work for Brianna. And if it doesn't, maybe I give some positive feedbacks of what I like and some reasons just why it doesn't happen to work for me, right? Because then the feedback is hugely important to continue to progress and innovate.
I love that. I think that's a really cool ending, because we all live in such a cool industry.
Oh yeah.
And we take really good care of patients. I think one thing I recently heard is there's not enough of us, right? I think there's plenty of us, but when we're seeing 12 patients a day or 15 patients a day, I mean, again, I turn into a pumpkin after like 22 or 23. But if we effectively and efficiently could see more patients where they feel taken care of, we feel taken care of, our team feels taken care of, and there's no advantage points here, is really when this industry flourishes. So it's not about taking your piece of the cookie, it's about making the cookie bigger every step that you can. That's what is so special about meeting Kyle and Aaron and bringing this pod together and being able to share this love for our profession now through books and continued learning. So
I love it. So, well, and with that, I want to respect everyone's time, but we are going to do this again next month. We'll publish the date. Atomic Habits is the book for next month. Kyle is his absolute favorite book. I don't think I've ever heard him lecture without mentioning Atomic Habits, which is a good thing because I will have a new stack of paper to be taking notes on. I'm going to class next month with Kyle. But fantastic book. And then in January, we are welcoming Trevor Trevor's with team, but he lurks in the background and listens to all of these and said, "This is awesome. I've got a suggestion for a book." And I said, "By all means, please do." So The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday is what we're going to be discussing in January. So we will link in the show notes to the website where you can see the upcoming dates and a link to buy the book or the audiobook. So you can join along with us. We love the discussions. I personally, selfishly like what I'm getting out of this, and this group and throughout the whole month, the text chain of what you're reading and what you're thinking about. And so we want to invite everybody along with us. All right. So with that, book nerds, we're going to call an end to this one and look forward to next time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye.
That was fun.
Good stuff, guys.